by saying thank you to Kate Blaylock, to Andreas Neff, and to Anthea Sellis and the staff at ICA for making this event possible. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Trudy Peterson, and I'm here representing the section on Archives and Human Rights of the International Council on Archives. This series of First Tuesday Talks is a program of the section, and I'd like to tell you about the upcoming events. On October 5, we will have Edo Mezi, who was a member of the Tunisian Truth Commission as an archivist, and he will be talking about his experience there. On December 7, we will have Giulia Borrera from Italy, who testified in 2 separate trials of Condor cases in Italy. Condor was the South African project in which countries shared information to identify and eliminate or to kill people that they deemed undesirable. Then on February 1st, we will have Gilles Manseron of France, who will be talking about the issues between France and Algeria over archives. And then in April, we will have a team of people talking about climate change and how to map the effect of climate change on archives. You need to know that we don't have money at the moment for translation or automatic translation of these sessions. So the sessions will be in the language of choice of the speaker. So the October session will be in Arabic, December will be in English, February will be in French, and April will be in Spanish. The meetings are being recorded. We are going to post the recordings online at the ICA website. They'll be recorded, that is, if the speaker agrees. And today's speaker has indeed agreed. Let me talk then a minute about the format of the session. We're going to ask our speaker to talk for 40 or 45 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions and comments. You can do that 2 ways. You can write a question into the chat function, or you can use the raised hand function and we will call on you. It's probably easier to use the chat function, but we'll try to monitor both of them. Now, for the morning or afternoon or evening, where you are, we have with us Graham Dominy. Graham was the National Archivist of South Africa from 2001 to 2014. He holds a PhD in African Studies from University of London. While he was National Archivist, he had the responsibility of bringing in the records of the Truth Commission of South Africa and trying to manage the difficulties that presented. He also was the host in 2003 of the International Conference of the Roundtable on Archives, where the Human Rights Working Group was established. Human Rights Working Group was the predecessor of today's section. So Graham has been crucially involved in human rights and archives for a very long time. With that, here's Graham.
Thank you, Trudy. I think it's easiest across the time zone simply to say hello, everybody. Thank you very much for your interest in this topic, and I'm very honored to have been asked to deliver this talk, which I believe is the first talk of the section, and I hope that this will go well and that the other talks will be as well attended. So I believe there's a responsibility on me to try and meet your expectations. I'd like to say as an introduction that what I'm about to say is very much based on my chapter in the book by Perrine and edited by Perrine Canavaggio, Jens Ball, and Antonio, who I see has joined us. So it has been adapted, but it's available in that work if anybody wants to see it and read it when they when they go to bed. So let's get going. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the major initiative, the first major initiative of the first democratic government of South Africa, headed by President Nelson Mandela. And I'm going to examine I'm going to call it the TRC. The TRC in 3 dimensions. The records that the TRC sought to undertake its work, the records that the TRC itself generated, and the conflicting positions on the access regime to the access regime regarding those records. But let's start with the thoughts of the chairperson of that commission, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He said, "Without memory, there is no healing. Without forgiveness, there is no future." And that vision infused the work of the TRC. Let's move on to the archival approach. In 2007, 6 years after the final close-up of the TRC, Sarah Tyack, the former keeper of public records and national archivist of the UK, addressed a conference at the Nelson Mandela Foundation in South Africa and stated a very simple but fundamental archival truth. First, get the record. And in these times, one needs to add another imperative. Do not lose the record. For a national archives to fulfill this mandate, it needs to be trusted by citizens and by the state and properly resourced by the state. Losing the record can happen because the agencies holding the record will not trust the archives, or there is destruction of the records before they can be transferred to a national archive, or because of neglect after they are so transferred. I'm going to get back to this latter point when I discuss the Zondo Commission, which will probably be the first time most of the non-South African audience has heard of it. Moving on from 2007 to 2011, Trudy Peterson emphasized that in addition to a right to know, there is a duty on governments to support the right to remember. Without supporting the critical services that are provided by a national archive, governments cannot support their citizens' right to remember. Okay. The right to know is one of the most broad and fundamental human rights. In many ways, it frames the relationship between the citizen and the state. In the South African Constitution, this is encapsulated in the Bill of Rights as the right to freedom of expression, which includes the freedom of the press and other media, freedom to receive or impart information or ideas, freedom of artistic creativity, and academic freedom and freedom of scientific research. The Constitution of South Africa also provides a right of access to information, which stipulates that everyone has the right of access to A, any information held by the state, B, any information that's held by another person that is required for the exercise or protection of any rights. Now, the TRC was working before the final constitution was adopted, and the implementation of these rights didn't really affect the work of the TRC. They're all, the rights are implemented through laws passed by Parliament. And apart from two, that's the right to life and the right to human dignity, interesting. We were talking about the Tunisian example a little earlier, Trudy. And in South Africa, the right to human dignity and the right to life are absolute. Other rights are not absolute. Administering and interpreting the rights in the archival context requires a delicate balancing act. The ICA's principle of access to archives gives professional operational guidelines which are of great value to archivists, but each national archives will find that it has its own particular issues to address. The South African Constitution, encapsulated in the Bill of Rights, gives the right of freedom of expression and breaks it down as freedom of the press and other media, freedom to receive or impart information or ideas, freedom of artistic creativity. I'm sorry, I'm repeating the page. It's often difficult for archivists to get politicians and decision makers to understand the needs and processes of their national archives. This is particularly so in a time of transition. We are more than 20 years beyond the advent of democracy in South Africa, and yet I think we are still in a time of transition, or perhaps revision. At such times, the National Archives runs the risk of being seen as irrelevant in a forward-looking, newly regenerated political structure, or perhaps worse, as being seen as the last vestige of the discredited old order or ancien regime. Without obtaining the records, the archives are empty and history cannot be written. Present turmoil is more difficult to understand, which is something that is being hotly debated in South Africa at this moment. And the future is more difficult for the present generation to shape. This is particularly true in countries undergoing major political and social transformation. And it's during such times of transformation that the archives are at their most vulnerable through loss from their destruction by the creators, mistrust of the archives as an institution, preventing the orderly transfer of records, or neglect at the archives through resource starvation. All of these, unfortunately, applied in the case of the records of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I will now turn to. It's well known to us as professionals that a careful analysis of the archival record in both written and oral form can lay bare the chief features of a governmental system, in this case, the South African apartheid system, and contextualize the uneven development, social contradiction, and anomalies at the end of South Africa's first decade of democracy. In 1994, this was more than just an intellectual need. It was an emotional and political imperative born of the processes of negotiation and conflict that led to the establishment of the Government of National Unity, headed by President Nelson Mandela. Those who'd been oppressed, who'd lost loved ones, whose lives and livelihoods had been destroyed, thirsted to know the reasons why, and some thirsted for revenge. On the other hand, the apartheid generals, the chiefs of police, the spies and agents of the regime still had enough power to wreck the negotiated settlement and to torment the new rulers through blackmail and coercion for years to come. The establishment of a mechanism to address the needs of the oppressed without provoking the former oppressors into revolt and racial civil war was essential. Therefore, one of the most important institutions that the newly elected democratic parliament established in the years following 1994 was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This had the legislated mandate to investigate the atrocities of the past, expose the evils that were committed in apartheid's name, and in the name of those struggling to overthrow the system, as well as the apartheid perpetrators, to give amnesty to perpetrators who fully disclosed their misdeeds, if such misdeeds had a political purpose, and to build a database of those victims who required compensation or restitution in some way or another. The aim of the TRC was summed up in its name: to discover the truth and to promote or attempt to promote or achieve reconciliation. Let's look at the archival aspects of the TRC, and there are three issues that are of relevance here. In the first place, in order to fulfill its mandate to discover the truth about the apartheid past, the TRC searched for and, when necessary, seized many of the records of those involved in the apartheid security apparatus. This required the intervention of archivists in support of other investigators. In the second place, the TRC generated a vast amount of documentation during its lifespan in all modern media, paper-based, audiovisual, and electronic. And in the third place, the TRC made certain archives-related recommendations in its report that required an official response from the National Archives and other agencies. So let's look at their hunt for the records of oppression. The TRC was hampered in its efforts to obtain documentation about apartheid atrocities by a lack of resources, staff, and time, and more importantly, by obstructionism from within the former security apparatus and other sections in the apartheid bureaucracy. Above all, it was severely hampered in its efforts by the massive and illegal destruction of records ordered by the government of former state president F.W. de Klerk in the months leading up to the first democratic elections on 27 April 1994. The new government did not find fully intact anything equivalent to the Stasi archives in the former German Democratic Republic. That sort of bulk of information that revealed how the entire system operated was not available in one type of archival record. It had to be constructed from many. I may add an observation that a former TRC official made to me. He said that perhaps the only offense that could be conclusively pinned on former President de Klerk was ordering the destruction of state documents without following the requirements of the old South African Archives Act, which provided a modest fine for the illegal destruction of official records. Now, the TRC was helped by the fact that there had been a whistleblower on the destruction of official records. He was a member of the staff of the National Archives, and he went on to work for the TRC in its search for records. The 5-volume report of the TRC describes at some length the steps taken to search for records documenting the atrocities of apartheid. There were inspections of various offices, correspondence with various agencies, and the use of legal warrants and subpoenas to seize documentation. The documentation that was located included surviving records of the State Security Council and the parallel government of securocrats that swung the resources of the state behind the total strategy of former President P.W. Botha. During the 1980s, there was the formal state apparatus with the ministries of agriculture and finance and foreign affairs and everything else that a state has, provincial government and so on, and an increasingly toothless parliament. But parallel with that structure, matching it at every step of the way, from local government to provincial government to national government and each department, there was what they called the securocratic state, the state that was not accountable to parliament and existed to maintain the safety and security of the apartheid structure. The second set of records were files on individuals from the section of the Justice Department, the DOJ, I'll refer to it later, which was charged with administering the legislation authorizing the detention without trial of various persons, and also intrusive observation into private lives, eavesdropping into telephone conversations, etc. The files of the security police, the secret police, military documentation, and secret intelligence files from the National Intelligence Agency and its Orwellian name predecessor, BOSS, the Bureau of State Security. The National Archives seconded officials such as Vern Harris to assist in this process. Harris subsequently exercised considerable influence on the archives' related recommendations of the TRC. Now, I must note here that international experts such as Trudy Peterson also advised the TRC on archives matters. Harris left the National Archives in 2001 to head a non-governmental organization called the South African History Archives, SAHR, which was modeled on the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C. And it ran a Freedom of Information project centered on TRC files and other documentation from the apartheid era. Various writers and political activists have subsequently claimed that much evidence was hidden from the TRC and only came to light later as a result of PIA. That's our Freedom of Information Act, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, and I will use the acronym PIA from now on. PIA applications that were submitted to the military, among others. After the closure of the TRC offices in 2001, the National Archives, via bureaucratic and diplomatic means, managed to secure the transfer of files relating to prisoners, political prisoners, that were in the custody of the Department of Correctional Services, the former Apartheid Prisons Administration. These are not part of the TRC archives, but are kept under the same secure conditions as TRC archives. Let's look at the archiving of the TRC's records. Oh no, before I start on that, let me say one thing. The TRC process spawned a number of other activities, one of which can best be called the Missing Persons Bureau. This is a small agency which tries to locate the missing persons, the people, the disappeared ones, or their bodies, and searches the country for evidence. And in that process, and they've had a lot more time to do it than the TRC had, although they were never as big as the TRC. And in that process, they found a lot of local records, which would have been of great relevance to the TRC, but which the TRC never had time to look at. Okay, looking at the archiving of the TRC's own records, the National Archives had to undertake them under difficult conditions of dual control and sometimes conflicting legislation and access requirements. At the end of the TRC's business in 2001, all their records were physically transferred to the National Archives, which is located in Pretoria at one end of the country from the TRC's headquarters in Cape Town. So there was quite an amusing course, a series of events in getting them transferred, with secret trains in the middle of the night, a military escort from the railway siding. They didn't go to the main station in Pretoria. They were escorted to the National Archives in a convoy of military vehicles with tanks at the front and tanks at the back. But they arrived safely. Equally difficult as the complicated access requirements, but much less easy to deal with in the archival sense, was the very public criticism by a few activists engaged in exercising their newly minted constitutional rights, a campaign against various state agencies, including the National Archives, which state agencies responsible for these and other records. So archivists, I'm sure, don't need to be reminded that they are targets of both people within state organizations and the citizens of the country they serve. And they have to try and serve both. The march of events in South Africa and the continuing process of democratizing South Africa overtook some of the TRC's archival recommendations. They recommended that one of their thoughts was a separate agency which would hold the TRC archives. Then they decided they should go to the National Archives. And they should be open to all immediately. However, while the TRC was sitting, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, PIA, was passed into law and took effect in the year 2000. This is the constitutionally mandated Freedom of Information legislation, as I said, abbreviated as PIA. And it lays down conditions under which information can be sought. And this superseded the recommendations of the TRC. At the very end of its life, Parliament passed a sort of housekeeping act, tidying up its affairs and making the Department of Justice its successor in title. And it assumed responsibility in terms of the amended legislation for all the assets and liabilities of the TRC, including its intellectual property, which was taken to include TRC records. Although the archives, the TRC itself had recommended these come to the National Archives. Okay, we've got them to the National Archives. Let's sum up the situation as it pertained then. As far as is known, all TRC records, all official TRC records are at the National Archives. I'm excluding records that may have been kept by various commissioners who kept their own records themselves and either wrote books or gave them to universities or whatever. Some even left the country. The archives appointed 2 former officials of the TRC to assist with the processing and management of their records and work with the PIA, Freedom of Access to Information requests. Because of the wording of the amended TRC legislation, we had to set up a joint committee with the Department of Justice and with the National Intelligence Agency to implement access requests to the TRC records in terms of the PIA Act. We also equipped the archives with the necessary infrastructure to manage the TRC records securely. And we established a project, a project was established to archive the electronic records of the TRC. As far as I'm aware, after this length of time, that has never been completely fulfilled. Steps that still need to be undertaken. Let's look at that. 20 years have passed since the year 2001. And in terms of the National Archives and Records Act of South Africa, state records fall into the custody of the National Archives after 20 years. 20 years after their creation. And now the TRC is closed down for 20 years. So it's now a hot debate as to whether or not the arrangements that existed with the Department of Justice should continue, or whether or not the National Archives can exercise complete control within the framework of the laws of the TRC records. And I argue that the latter should be the case. There's one matter, as far as I'm aware, there's still one item of outstanding business, and it's very important. The Department of Justice still controls the TRC's website. And in terms of the Archives Act, that should be transferred to the National Archives. However, the National Archives unfortunately lacks the IT capacity to manage it, let alone upgrade it. Okay, let's touch on accessing sensitive records. I've talked of this to some extent. And my time is, I've still got a bit of time, but I'll try and pass over this quickly. There is a gap between the requirements of the National Archives Act and the requirements of PIA and other constitutionally mandated legislation, such as access to information, promotion of privacy, protection of privacy, and personal data. The Archives Act was passed, in my personal opinion, passed prematurely in 1995, just after democracy, before the other acts. It was signed into law in 96, went through Parliament in 95, before the other acts mandated by the Constitution became law. And I know that there is work being done on a new act, which is very desperately needed. In terms of PIA, all state information is open, and this has specific restrictions which fall under broad categories of protection of third-party privacy, state security, documentation generated in the process of policy formulation, for example, papers prepared by officials to advise ministers, and certain commercial and intellectual property restrictions. During the terms of office of the previous president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, whose name many people may know, new secrecy legislation was being worked on. And there was a great widespread fear articulated by the opposition parties that this legislation would be used to cover up state corruption. I've referred briefly to the Zondo Commission. I'm going to refer to it again here. Evidence has been presented at the Zondo Commission, of which more anon, demonstrating this was a very real risk. Mercifully, the parliamentary process, excuse me a moment, was not finalized during Zuma's term of office, but it appears that the government of President Cyril Ramaphosa, current president, Ramaphosa was chair of the Constitutional Assembly that wrote the democratic constitution, so he's a very different person to his predecessor. The current government is much more amenable to allowing a very open approach to these issues. The National Archives applies PIA as its primary guideline, as it gives expression to a constitutional right, and it's therefore superior to the National Archives Act. Arranging access to TRC records was a problem with the system of dual control. However, in order to reduce delays, the National Archives allowed open access to all TRC records that related to public hearings and discussions. Effectively, this meant that only a minority of TRC access requests were required to go through the dual committee system between the Archives, Department of Justice, and National Intelligence. These records of the so-called Section 29 hearings of the TRC, which were held, the only work of the TRC that was held in camera, in secret. Access to other sensitive records is also dealt with in terms of PIA principles. For example, a person may have access to their own records if they were a political prisoner, but access will not be granted to a third party unless the ex-prisoner or his family give his or her or their permission. As National Archivist, I found that the military and the police were very cooperative, usually, on access requests and very professional. As a researcher, I have myself used military records, and I find the military archives are extremely professional, despite what a lot of critics say. 20 years has passed, and one thing that is not often considered by politicians debating secrecy or privacy legislation is how long should protections last. In English common law, inherited by South Africa, there's no protection for a dead person. PIA is not clear on this matter. There's an implication that restrictions, the privacy restrictions I referred to, elapse after 20 years, which accords more or less with the National Archives Act, but there's been no test case to this of this, to the best of my knowledge. However, the protection of personal data legislation and the protection of private information that's been passed is not clear, and like much legislation, didn't have much input from archivists. It was intended to protect the rights of people from banks and credit companies spilling the beans on their private circumstances. It would be useful if archivists could give their opinions on such legislation. Now, to revert to the TRC, the first report was presented to Nelson Mandela while he was still president, the first draft, the first volume of the report. But there were 5 volumes, and many of them were presented to Mandela's successor, Thabo Mbeki. And he was against the establishment of the TRC from the start. When the records were transferred to the State National Archives in 2001, during the second year of Mbeki's presidency, there were no additional funding forthcoming to provide the any special care. I beg your pardon, ladies and gentlemen. The special care for the records over and above the measures that I've already outlined. Over the past 10 years, the condition of the National Archives has deteriorated even further as funding has been slashed. And the department to which the National Archives is attached has more or less regarded it as an afterthought. Now, during the term of Jacob Zuma's presidency, the coffers of the state were systematically looted and state governance structures were weakened and hollowed out. Civil society resisted, and the public protector, the Ombud, woman, the gallant advocate Thuli Madonsela, an eminent and widely respected person, investigated every act of corruption that she could. And just before her term of office expired, she recommended the appointment of a judicial inquiry into state corruption. President Zuma resisted this, but it was near the end of his term of office as well, and he'd already been forced out of party leadership. He was no longer the leader of the ANC. So he was in a weak position, and he had to formalize the appointment of the commission. And it wasn't under a judge of his choosing either. It was under the leadership of the Deputy Chief Justice, Judge Raymond Zondo. This is relevant because the Zondo Commission has heard the most comprehensive evidence into the state of the country since the TRC investigated the country under apartheid. In terms of the Commissions Act, which establishes the mechanisms for all commissions of inquiry, the records of the Zondo Commission should be forwarded to the Department of Justice when it concludes its business, and thence to the National Archives. However, there are discussions taking place for the entire corpus of the administrative records and the mountains of evidence accumulated to be digitized under the auspices of the Department of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, and then for them to be secured by some sort of independent agency. A similar suggestion for TRC records was shot down at that stage. No, I'm sorry. I beg your pardon again, ladies and gentlemen. The reason for this approach is, as I talked about the hollowing out of the state apparatus, trust in government structures has been compromised to such an extent that the National Archives, by default, along with other organs of state, is no longer regarded as a safe haven for the history of the country, which is a terrible tragedy. It still has the trained staff and the infrastructure to be able to preserve the Zondo Commission records. It lacks the finances and other resources, but it's now an adjunct of the National Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, and has never been a priority of that department. I'm going to call it a misunderstood stepchild. Now, if anyone wanted to exert pressure on how to either dispose of or steal or interfere with the records of the Zondo Commission in the National Archives, I believe that such pressure would come via a department that is largely unaware of the importance of the National Archives, rather than directly at the National Archives itself. Okay, I'm now going to conclude. The actions and therefore the records of the Zondo Commission reveal some of the deepest truths about South African society and some of the deepest disappointments since the advent of democracy. They are of equal importance to the TRC records, which revealed the secrets of the apartheid era. It's now time for an open debate on the fate of these records. And perhaps the ICA discussion today may be the start of such a process. In discussion with Trudy before we started, she mentioned, of course, the fact that some of the prosecutions recommended by the TRC that have been stalled during the period of President Mbeki and President Zuma are being resumed now that we have now that we are rebuilding the capacity of the National Prosecuting Authority. So I'm going to conclude by saying, quoting the words of Bishop Tutu again, we must remember our past so that we do not repeat it. And Archbishop Tutu was the keynote speaker at the Citra Conference on Archives and Human Rights in 2003. Finally, to preserve our past for future generations to study, in addition to the remark Sarah Tyack made, first get the record, archivists, do not lose the record. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Graham. Remember, participants, that you can type messages into chat or use the raised hand function to participate. Let me begin, though, by asking Graham, it would seem to me that opening the prosecutions that have not been followed up from the TRC would mean that the TRC records would be a central resource for those prosecutors. Do you have any sense of how that might work?
Speaking personally, I would regret the fact that it might give the Department of Justice another excuse to try and keep its claws on the control of the TRC archives. I would rather the prosecutors related to the TRC archives the way prosecutors do to other court records, which are at the National Archives, and there are sections within the National Archives that provide records back to the courts if they need them, or to the prosecutors. But rather than have, I would not like to see the Department of Justice in a position as gatekeeper any longer.
As I remember, Graham, not all records came to the National Archives right away, that there was a small body of records that went to the Department of Justice and then later were transferred to the archives. Is that correct? And how did that happen?
Yes, that is correct. I'm now trying to remember exactly which records they were. We obtained the files of political prisoners going around the Department of Justice to the prison service. And because the Director General of what was then Arts, Culture, Science and Technology had been a political prisoner himself and had a vested interest in it, he used his influence to be able to get the records. as I said earlier, the work of the so-called Missing Persons Bureau, it's not the correct title, of Madeleine Fullard in her section, has revealed that there are still local records scattered all over the country, which would require a massive effort to put together. But it's an effort that should be done.
We have a question in the chat from Sophia Kirsopoulos, who says, is the securocratic state modeled after the Star Chamber?
That's a wonderful question. And I think the answer is probably yes, but more by accident than design. I don't think the founders of the securocratic state were that historically perceptive.
What do you think are the next steps for actually getting the, especially the electronic records, secured and made available in some way to the public? Is it simply money? Is it money and staff?
That's the very short answer. It's ignorance as well, and not ignorance of the size, I beg your pardon, on the part of the archives or its staff, but of the political and administrative controllers of the archives as an institution, plus other departments of state where records are not regarded as a priority. And I think I'm stating a near to universal truth here. Governments think of IT as a solution to record keeping problems, and that is not so. It is simply another method of record keeping, and the problems don't go away.
We have a long question from Antonio Gonzalez Quintana. Antonio, would you like to unmute and ask the question yourself?
I have written my question in the chat, but I do it very happy. Nice to be with you, Graham. Thank you very much for this talking. We see that after more than 20 years that Bishop Tutu handed Nelson Mandela the TRC report, the records continue being under a rule of access as that you have described. My question is, what would be the date, the year on which the 20 years required by the Archives law or by the Promotion and Access to Information Act would be considered passed for a free access, for an unlimited and unrestricted access to documents? 20 years after that, the offices of the TRC close, or 20 years after what? Because 20 years have already passed, as you have already said. And my other question, the second one, is why the decisive records by the Truth Commission during its work must also wait for 20 years. I have read in your article that the section on sensitive records of the National Archives give the order to the officials that other records than those under restriction because of the quality of information given under confidentiality should be opened, and this was made in 2010. Do you think it's necessary to regulate this in an act, in a law?
Thank you, Antonio, for the question. It's very good to see you as well. Thank you. Your first question, the year is this one, the year 2021, because the Archives Act says that after 20 years after a record is created, it is transferred to the archives and should be open to the public for use. And the TRC closed down, therefore it no longer generated any records in the year 2001. So I've actually been arguing that the records should be completely under the control of the National Archives. That does not ensure automatic access to those records by everybody for any reason, because of the other pillars of legislation, such as PIA, which protects the right to privacy, as you yourself said, state security, etc. But it would make the administration of that act much, much easier and enable people to see it far more readily and far more quickly. Because the problem with the dual control is enormous delays. Remind me of your second question again, please.
Records sized by the Truth Commission.
Oh,
the regime of access to
they, if I'm answering this correctly, they advise that everything should be open immediately. Well, that I'm not going to go into that again. I think the records that they themselves acquired should also be open. Issues of state security, really, I can't see many of them applying. Political security, that is the issue. And that, I think, is why President Mbeki was so against the TRC, because of, it's often not what's in the records, but what people are afraid might be in the records. And that's the area of ignorance that one is up against. So I would like to see the matter thoroughly debated. And I see there was another question about the Zondo Commission. And it's in that context that I'd like to see the debate take place, because I think it's also relevant to the TRC.
Just to follow up, Graham, there was pressure at the end, I believe, from at least the police to return records that had been used by TRC and not leave them within the corpus of TRC records. Did that happen?
I'm trying to remember, Trudy, it's 20 years ago. I think there were some records that were returned by the TRC itself, not by the National Archives.
No, by the TRC.
Yes, it did happen.
We have a question in the chat from Romain Laudafin, who says, to follow up on Antonio's question, is there any comprehensive finding aid for the TRC archives? And if not, is it under development?
I regret to say that there wasn't when I retired from the National Archives, and I don't think one has been fully developed since then. There was a finding aid to the electronic records, but not to the records. The access is very much in the memory of the experienced officials. And I speak subject to correction, and I see that there's a South African archivist who's commented that this is a priority task.
And I do see that I skipped over a question from Alexio Mozzi, which is, having seen the mistakes made when the TRC records were transferred, what advice do you have to the current archives management regarding the transfer of the Zondo Commission records?
I think they must engage with the Commission itself and with the Department of Justice as soon as possible. The Zondo Commission is closing up fairly soon, and there will be a few months while the judge considers his findings and writes his report. So now is an opportune time to actually begin an interaction. And even if there is a nominal requirement that those records remain under, not nominal, a legal requirement, that those records remain under the control of the Department of Justice for 20 years, they should physically be held at the National Archives for safety reasons. And any digitization project that is undertaken in terms of those records should be done with advice and with the participation of the National Archives, and not just with the participation of a service provider. And thirdly, to relate to Romain's question, the archive should set about generating the finding aids as soon as possible and not wait to take over legal control, as unfortunately happened with the TRC record.
I don't see any other question in the chat room. If there is one, we could take one more. If not, Graham, any last words?
People made the mistake of thinking that an institution like the TRC was a one-off. It isn't. It stays with you and lives with you as an individual who works with it, and it lives with the society that created it and whose advice impinges on that society for 1 or 2 generations at least. And its record should live forever. Thank you, Trudy.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you all who have joined us. And remember that on October 5, we will have Adel Maizi talking about his experience with the Tunisian Truth and Dignity Commission. We hope to see all of you then. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you very much.